Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, I am thrilled and excited to have the National Archives Foundation here with us today. They are going to be debuting. This is the first time, so Maine, you should be proud. I begged and I pleaded and I said, can we do this? And they said yes. We're going to talk about the impact of racial discrimination on Black Americans during the Jim Crow era, looking at primary sources, supports through the National Archives Foundation. I'm super excited to potentially have this be the kickoff to a bigger series. Jim, don't forget, we'd started that conversation. I'm going to put you on the spot there a little bit. But without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the National Archives Foundation staff. With us today, we have Charles Flanagan and Jim Dumas.
Thanks, Joe. And you can hold me to that. We're very thrilled to be able to offer more opportunities to Maine and educators all around the country. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Dumas. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the National Archives Foundation. The National Archives Foundation has been a 30-year nonprofit partner of the National Archives. The foundation is dedicated to supporting the educational, the cultural, and yes, the civics programming that occurs at the National Archives. And our goal is to bring all of this wonderful things that the archives offer to the entire nation around the country. For the last decade or so, our board has been concerned with civics and the lack of civic participation in our country. We see educators on the front lines able to educate young people in the hope that they will participate in this republic that was designed for them to participate in. We also know you have a very difficult job, and that's why we believe we have a tremendous resource that's available to you and that we're going to present today. The archives is filled with primary source materials. These are documents that, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, were from the past. They either align ourselves and are our forming and framing documents, and are also records of the history, whether it's the Jim Crow era or whether it was women's suffrage. This is what happened. We hold the history. And from there, we find this a very easily teachable moment to utilize these documents in a classroom setting and potentially engage in difficult topics like race and how folks are engaging today's society in a civil way or the lack thereof. So with that, I wanted to introduce the main event. His name is Dr. Charles Flanagan. He is the Supervisor of Educational Programs at the Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives. Now, the Center is the unit of the National Archives that preserves and makes available the official records of the United States Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. Flanagan has been at the Center since 2009, and prior to joining that staff, he served as a high school and a middle school teacher for over 30 years. So he was in your boat. He knows what you're facing, and we hope that this presentation is going to be very instrumental and helpful for you. So with that, I'll be back at the end, but let's bring on Charlie. Charles?
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm going to share a screen with you so that we can all be looking at the same thing. And so now you should see on your screen a slide that says teaching about racial discrimination in the Jim Crow era with resources from the Center for Legislative Archives at the National Archives. And the other thing I'd like you to do, of course, is open your chat box if you haven't already, because at various times in this presentation, I'll ask you to respond to questions or documents. But let's get started. So seem to be frozen here. Here we go. Our guiding question: how did Jim Crow laws and practices limit the freedom of Black Americans? And as you know, Jim Crow is a term, a phrase, a name that refers to a system of laws and practices that were set up to sustain white supremacy. And so how did those Jim Crow laws and practices limit the freedoms of Black Americans is what we're going to talk about. The Reverend Martin Luther King eloquently framed the struggle for equality when he spoke during the 1963 March on Washington. He said, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they'll be not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. So we're going to explore the history that lies between the Reconstruction era and the Civil Rights era of the 1960s. I'm going to be drawing from materials that we have on our website, and the address of our website of the National Archives where I work. So the National Archives has a big website, which is archives.gov, and I work at a subdivision of that agency, which is the Center for Legislative Archives. We have the Records of Congress. So our website address you see on the screen is archives.gov legislative. And we have 5 lessons on that website that I'm going to be drawing from today. And you see the titles of them. They're reviewing the Civil War and Reconstruction and the others. And you'll notice one has a big red star next to it. And the title of that one is The Impact of Racial Discrimination on the Lives of Black Americans in the Jim Crow Era. And that'll be the primary focus of my talk today. And I will take a couple of documents from the other lessons, but dig deeper into this one. Teaching about racial discrimination from the earliest days of the colonial era, from then on, presents moral challenges because from 1607 onward, Europeans exploited and dispossessed Native American tribes. And from very soon after that, from 1619 onward, Europeans instituted long-lasting systems of race-based enslavement. But when you're teaching about racial discrimination after the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, then you have to deal with both a moral and a constitutional dimension of the question. So it's always morally troubling, but it's also constitutionally troubling after 1868. And I'm going to explain why by drawing 2 documents from our lesson, Reviewing the Civil War and Reconstruction. This is one of the 5 lessons on our website. And these are next 2 documents will be taken from it. And the first is the court decision in the Dred Scott case of 1857. And I think this is an important place to start because it creates like a bookend that you'll see frames the conversation about civil rights. Because in 1846, when a slave named Dred Scott and his wife Harriet sued for their freedom in St. Louis, they entered into an 11-year struggle, a legal struggle that culminated in a decision issued by the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney read the majority opinion of the court, and here's an excerpt from his decision. The question is simply this: can a Negro, whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves, become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such, become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed to the citizen? We think they are not, and that they are not included, and they were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution. So if you are of African ancestry, you are fundamentally not a citizen of the United States. And that was the court's decision in 1857. But what's important for our conversation today is that just 12 years later, there's a game-changing amendment to the Constitution, a constitutional guarantee of equality. The 14th Amendment was potentially revolutionary in its impact on the Constitution. And it also could have fundamentally changed the federal government and American society, because just a dozen years after the Supreme Court had ruled that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights, this amendment said basically the opposite. And if you notice on the screen, the 14th Amendment, Section 1 says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That is a remaking of the promise of the American Constitution. It is an American revolution in itself because it is undoing the system of racial separation that had existed from the Dred Scott decision. So it raises the question, by incorporating this idealistic promise into the Constitution, it raises the question, is this Reconstruction era a revolution? And this is the second of the lessons I'll draw two documents from, was Reconstruction a revolution? And in this lesson, we ask the kids to develop their analytical skills by working with documents from this era, first wrestling with the question of what is a revolution, and then from that definition, figuring out, was the Reconstruction period a revolution? Well, let me get you involved in that quest, because we have on the screen now legislation that was introduced by Charles Sumner, the same Charles Sumner who was caned in the 1850s in the Senate. In 1873, he introduced a bill which became law in 1875 as the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read what's on the right side of the screen there, especially the part that's underlined in red that says, no citizen of the United States shall, by reason of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, be excepted or excluded from the full and equal enjoyment of any accommodation, advantage, facility, or privilege. And it goes on. Now, I'd like you to use the chat box, and I'd like you to respond to the question so we kind of break the ice on the discussion part of this. How does this bill that Charles Sumner has introduced, how would that enforce the 14th Amendment? Good. And as you can see, America becomes a colorblind country legally when this law is enforced. And it was written because the southern states were passing black codes that were basically reinstituting racial separation, and even in a condition much like slavery in the South. But as you can see, Sumner is saying there'll be no racial distinction, that no one can suffer prejudice, and there'll be, as Karina says, equal protection for all. So that's in 1873. But when that legislation is being debated in Congress, then we get a number of petitions that flood in. And the one you see on the screen now is from the board and president of the St. Louis Public Schools. So basically from the St. Louis Public School Board. And they're going to write in against the passage of the Sumner Act. And here's an excerpt from their petition. So I put it in type up above, and then I took some excerpts of that and included them at the bottom of the screen for your convenience. But basically what the St. Louis Public School Board is arguing, they say public schools have been provided for the colored people of as good quality as those schools open for white children. Does anybody recognize that doctrine? And as we go along, if I ask questions and stuff, go ahead and just answer them in the chat box, or if you have observations you'd like to make. But does anybody recognize what they're saying there? Public schools have been provided for the colored people of as good a quality as those schools open for white children. Yes, Jill, it's the separate but equal doctrine about 20 years before the Plessy case. Now look at the second statement. Opening public school admissions to children of both races in the same schools would cause the withdrawal of large numbers of white children from public schools. Keep that line in mind, because that was a real strong concern in the 1870s, and it's going to be a persistent concern that we're going to see in later documents as we go along. So that's 1873, and we have an attempt to bring about a colorblind society, but also a pushback against that. So it begs the question of, has America changed? Has Reconstruction been a revolution? I mean, it's been a constitutional revolution, but has it been a social revolution? So we put a lesson up there that traces this question of equality. It's on our website from the 1830s to today. And I'm going to draw two documents from it just to kind of get you thinking about some of the questions of equality that you can engage your kids in. We're in the time period just after Reconstruction. As you know, that ends in the Compromise of 1877. The Supreme Court will strike down the Sumner Civil Rights Act in 1883 in cases known as the civil rights cases. And then in 1882, this law will be passed. This is passed 30 years after the beginning of a large-scale migration of people from China into the United States. Thousands of Chinese workers basically built the western half of the transcontinental railroad. And yet in 1882, Congress passed a law which said, whereas in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities within the territory thereof, therefore, Chinese are banned. Basically, it would be unlawful for any Chinese laborer to come into the United States. And that was the law from 1882 to 1943. And I put a rhetorical question at the bottom. And I think what it indicates about racial attitudes is that they're back. This is not a colorblind country. Your race matters a lot. And so if you happen to be of Chinese ancestry, you are fundamentally unwelcome in the United States. So we are drawing color lines in addition to white and black. We're also drawing color lines against Chinese people. However, the color line against African Americans is not gone. And the very troubling case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 brings that to the fore. And it's going to fundamentally change the law of the land because it'll be an important Supreme Court decision. And it started 5 years earlier when a group of concerned young men of New Orleans formed the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the separate car law, a law which required whites and blacks to ride in separate rail cars in Louisiana. The committee decided to press a test case on intrastate travel with the cooperation of the East Louisiana Railroad. So Homer Plessy seats himself in a white compartment and he's challenged by the conductor and he's arrested and charged with violating the state law. So that's the premise for the case. Now, there's a couple of things from the decision I took out because I think they raised some really interesting questions about race in America. If you look at the top paragraph, this is from the decision, and it says the petitioner was a citizen of the United States and a resident of the state of Louisiana of mixed descent in the proportion of 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood, that the mixture of colored blood was not discernible in him, and that he was entitled to every recognition, right, and privilege and immunity secured to the citizens of the United States of the white race by its Constitution and laws. So what do you think is the relevance of that underlined text? How does that get us thinking about the attitudes toward race in the 1890s? Jill, that's really interesting. Your bloodline. How did they know that Homer Plessy was an African, 1/8 African American, unless he told them so? And once he told them so, then it's their duty to throw him off the train, which they did. They physically threw him off the train, and it is a real high bar of racial concern. So we've come a long way from the 14th Amendment, a long way from the Sumner Civil Rights Act in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And in fact, the court rules, we cannot say that a law which authorizes or even requires the separation of the two races in public conveyances is unreasonable. So the reasonable thing is segregation, is what they're saying in 1896. And I find that really troubling. So we're going along and we're teaching with primary sources. And one of the challenges kids have is that they're not very good with visual primary sources. And so I thought we should bring in a couple of visual primary sources because they're a way to bridge from these antecedent things in the 19th century down to the late Jim Crow era. So, most of our records at the National Archives let you hear the voices of Americans. And there's some others that enable you to see their actions. And these two, I think, are in that second category. Here's one, and I hope you'll use this. Please take a moment and jot down the number that you see at the bottom of the screen. This is the National Archives identification number, because I think you'll want to use this. You go into our catalog at archives.gov, and in the search box, you enter that number, and it will yield for you this document. It is a map of lynchings in the United States created by the Colored Women's Club of Michigan, and it was submitted to Congress in 1922 in support of an anti-lynching bill. So how can this visual primary source be used to teach the 14th Amendment? Any ideas? Go ahead and put some in the chat box, and I'll share a couple with you as you're doing that. But there's a bunch of different things that are illustrated on this map. For one, you notice the red line that walls off the mostly the Confederate states, but there's a couple of others in there. And there's a note next to it, which I blew up on the side, and it said these 16 states furnished 88% of the lynchings from 1889 to 1921, the 31 years, 32 years that this map covers. But when you look at each state, you'll see that there are different numbers in there. You see the red number is the number of lynchings in that state during that 32-year period. And then the black number next to it, to the right of it, is the number of times representatives in that state have voted against anti-lynching legislation. And so if you look at some of the southern states, the numbers are astounding. If you look at Georgia, there were 429 lynchings in that 30-year period. So if you divide that number by the number of months within that 30-year period, you get a little bit over 1 lynching per month. If you take the 14 states, well, the 16 states that are in red there, and you total up the number of lynchings and divide by the number of months, you get something like 2 lynchings per week for over 30 years. So how frequently were these non-judicial murders taking place? Like twice a week. And so that gives you a picture of how charged racism was in America in the early 20th century. And I think it's a dramatic way to empower kids to discover. So you talk to them about how bad racism is, and it goes in one ear and out the other. But when you give them a map like this and have them crunch the numbers, it really gives you a picture. Here's another visual primary source. This was Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. in 1928. Now, this is like a work of art in the sense that it's framed. It's not just a, it's not just a candid shot. You'll notice that it's in the middle of the street. You'll notice the dome of the Capitol in the background. How does this image communicate to its viewer? That's just kind of, we'll just leave that as a rhetorical question so that we can cover more ground. But if you look at it, it's not just a random shot. You can see that it's very kind of stylized the way it's organized. What is this parade saying? And notice how many people are watching this parade. What is this parade saying about America? So that's 1928. If you want the kids to see the second Ku Klux Klan, there it is on parade. Kids sometimes think, okay, the Civil War happened, slavery ended, then everything was fine. Well, I guess what I've showed you so far is that things were not fine. In fact, racism intensified after the Reconstruction period ended, Plessy Ferguson, the lynchings, the Klan, and so on. And so racism was persistent and powerful in the World War II era. So what I did is I took documents from the last 16 years of the Jim Crow era, and I made a lesson about the impact of discrimination. And what I wanted to do with these documents is have a look at discrimination from the inside, to look at different situations and put kids in the context of having to ask about how these documents show discrimination affecting the lives of Americans. And so there are 2 of the questions from the lesson on here that I think will serve us. So we can ask these about a number of documents. Oh, and so Jamie's question, will we have access to this lesson? Yes. With the exception of a couple of, well, first of all, you can have the whole PowerPoint because I shared it with the National Archives Foundation, and they can share it with you through Joe Schmidt. and that would be fun. And but the 5 lessons that I pointed out are all in there. And with the exception of the map of lynchings and the Klan parade, all the other documents are in one of the lessons or the other. And so, you know, you can go back and just get those lessons and you can have all these documents plus a lot more. So anyway, how do the actions reflected in these documents show how Jim Crow affected the lives of Americans, and what underlying attitudes about racial equality can you discern in this document? So trying to get kids to dig a little deeper than just the surface level. So let's start with the segregated armed forces of World War II. And I know you probably know this, but just to be formal about it, roughly 1 million African Americans joined the US Armed Forces in World War II. And about half of those served overseas, while thousands of Black troops served in combat, such as the 92nd and 93rd All-Black Divisions and the Tuskegee Airmen. They were segregated. There were Black units and white units. The most common assignments for Black servicemen were rear guard, mopping up actions, and menial supply and requisition roles. So what did it feel like to be a soldier, a Black soldier in World War II, fighting in a segregated armed force? And we have a letter from a soldier stationed in Rome in 1944. And you'll notice that it was collected by the War Department, and they made this copy and they're using it for a communicative purpose. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It's not just the letter from this soldier, but if you look at the beginning of it, he says, "All my life, I've been hustling nickels and dimes to contribute to the Red Cross. Ever since I can remember, in school and in church, I've scuffled to belong to various Red Cross enterprises." And he's writing to his wife and he says, "You're forever telling me about working for the USO, contributing to the Red Cross. I don't believe that anything you could do would make me more angry than to hear of you giving another penny or spending another minute at a USO club. So what's the problem?" Well, here's the problem. The Frenchmen whom the American army fought against in North Africa, the same Frenchmen who've been responsible for killing American soldiers, have access to all the facilities of the Red Cross. This is a transcript I made from his letter because the typescript was a little bit hard to read. The Italians, the Germans, because they have white skin, if they're wearing the American uniform, they have access to all the facilities of the Red Cross. The same organization to whose benefits the Negro has contributed stands solidly on its feet and bluntly tells the American-born Negro soldier that we have a regulation that does not include Negroes in our program. I have found that one of the most insufferable fates that can happen is to be born an American Negro. So in other words, you can risk your life fighting against Nazism, but don't try to come to the USO and don't come to the Red Cross because you got the wrong color skin. And so, you know, how does that illustrate Jim Crow? And, you know, I think in the experience of an American fighting for the US, it's particularly galling to think about how the Jim Crow system even went overseas with the armed forces. But, you know, Jim Crow was alive and well at home after the war. Although the army was desegregated by President Truman in 1948, that didn't end Jim Crow. In fact, it went into a whole new area of American life. So, you know, there's the question of continuing old patterns of segregation, but what about when you have new innovations? Should they be segregated as well? And in the 20s and 30s, cities had begun constructing public swimming pools. So the question is, should they be segregated, or should you just allow everybody to swim in the municipal swimming pool that everybody's taxes have contributed toward? And over time, cities north and south began imposing racial segregation on their pools. So I have a quote at the top, which basically repeats what I just said. It's from a Marketplace radio broadcast that was on a couple years ago. And it explains about the history of segregating pools. But I got 3 newspaper articles from the 1949 to 1950 period to show you that the pool segregation issue is emerging in this time period. It's not going away, because here we have the Jackson, Mississippi Advocate over on the left, and there they are in Mississippi, like 1,000 miles away at least, talking about the pool segregation issue in Washington, D.C., and talking about how segregation might be imposed on the city's pools. And then we have a big news item from about a year later, talking about how it's kind of remarkable that there'll be non-segregated swimming pools, in some of the DC neighborhoods. And then the third over here on the right is a big headline from page 1. 6 pools are going to be opened on a non-segregated basis. And that's a big news story. And you read in, and in the 4th paragraph of that story, I blew it up, and you can see it here next to the red arrow. It's a quote from Mr. Chapman. He says he hopes and believes that there will be no repetition of the racial troubles this year. He said he is most anxious to avoid any comment at this time that would aggravate the issue. So how is Jim Crow affecting the lives of Americans? Well, if you're an African American and you wish to use the swimming facility that you paid for, of course, you're not welcome. We have a letter that brings this issue into kind of a classroom setting that you can use to get kids to kind of dig in and try to discern some history from a primary source. It's from former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to President Harry Truman in 1950. And she's referring to the racial segregation in swimming pools. And she's talking about St. Louis and Washington. Here's a closer look. She says, Mr. Joseph Lohman of the National Committee on Segregation in the nation's capital has just written me of the success they've had in St. Louis in keeping their swimming pools unsegregated, which means that they're resisting a very powerful movement to segregate them. He tells me that the courageous attitude shown by the Truman administration in supporting democratic principles in the Washington pools has helped the situation all over the country. You and Secretary Chapman have shown great courage in bringing this about. It is these step-by-step achievements which will in the end bring us real equal rights in our nation. A related issue, the same, related in time, but bigger in scale, is the question of segregated schools. And we saw that in the St. Louis document from 1873. This is from the 1951 to 52 time period. And on the right of the screen, you have the complaint from the case that would become Brown versus Topeka Board of Ed. And you notice at the top, Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States forbids the racial separation herein practiced. So separate but equal violates the 14th Amendment is going to be their basic argument. And they mentioned Plessy Ferguson a couple of times and mentioned how the precedent from there is inapplicable. But again, I got some newspaper articles because they will bring this out a little bit. And this one is from the Washington newspapers in 1952, and it's reporting that the Supreme Court agrees to take up this case. They're going to hear what will become the Brown case. They put several cases together, and they'll agree to legislate on them. But further down in the article was this paragraph that I blew up and put on the left. Governor James F. Burns of South Carolina has said that if his state loses its fight in the courts to maintain segregation, the public school systems there will be abandoned. Other southern states, notably Georgia, Virginia, and Alabama, have taken steps which could lead to the abolition of the public school system in favor of privately operated classrooms. You remember in the 1870s how in St. Louis they worried about white flight? Well, here it is in the 1950s. And so we have a letter from Governor Burns to President Eisenhower. James Burns was not only governor of South Carolina, and I know we have a participant from his state, but he was one of the principal supporters of Franklin Roosevelt in the war effort in World War II. And he also was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Roosevelt, and he served for a couple of years in the early 40s. But here's an excerpt from his letter. He says, our counsel will argue that the United States Supreme Court has held that the 14th Amendment did not prohibit a state from enacting a law requiring separation of races in public schools, provided equal facilities were furnished to all students. Separate but equal, he says, is okay with us in 1953. I went a little further into this letter and I got this excerpt for you to ask you a question. One of the things that Governor Burns says, he says, the court has no right to legislate. The court might well conclude that conditions in Kansas were such that a law making distinction between the races was unreasonable. And this gets a little hard to follow, but he says, the court might say that in South Carolina case where the number of colored students in the school district in question is 10 to every one white student, the court cannot say that the action of the state is manifestly unreasonable. So the way I parse what he said is that if you have 10 black students to one white student, then it's reasonable to have segregation. So what underlying attitude about race is Governor Byrne exhibiting in his statement? It's okay to have integration if you only have a few African Americans, but if you have a lot of African Americans, then you got to have segregation. Can you put into words what that attitude is? Well, Kate, I think you nailed it. White supremacy. Yes, we have to have white supremacy in terms of number, or things will get out of hand. And you know, it's a governor saying that. Now, here's a cartoon from. We have a couple of ebooks of cartoons, and this one, they're all on our website. And they're all free. And this one's called A Visual History, and this is one of the cartoons in it. This was published in 1958. And this is a year after federal troops integrated the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. And you can see that what it's dramatizing in visual form is that the school board in Little Rock went to the court and asked to close the schools for 2.5 years, not integrate them for 2.5 years, so that they could get used to the fact that they would have to have integration. And so I think for the kids, this is a visual way to suggest that there are all kinds of roadblocks along the way to racial equality, and people were willing to shut down the public schools and rather than have them integrated. And it's a little hard to imagine that looking back from our perspective, but you know, the past is a foreign country to some extent, but that kind of makes it real, as does this. This is the fingerprints of Rosa Parks. They were taken on December 1st, 1955, when she was arrested for riding in the wrong section of a public bus. You know, like transportation is like this very important part of everyday life in the 1950s, kind of before cars were as commonplace as they would be later. And the buses were strictly segregated in southern states during the Jim Crow era. And, you know, this slide showing the fingerprints shows you what happens if you refuse to obey the segregation policy. You know, in history, we look back and we think of her as like a civil rights pioneer and everything was wonderful. But I think when you look at this, it really dramatizes the real world risk that she was taking in violating that. And, you know, you can see segregated America. If you look up at the top above the fingerprints, number 79521, color C. So, I mean, your race always matters. Now, this will take us into a little bit more of the danger, and I'll ask you to talk in the chat box about this one in just a minute, but I want you to take a look at this artifact. It's a handwritten letter sent to President Eisenhower in September of 1958. I found it very disturbing, and I found some of the illustrations that we used to decorate the letterhead kind of informative. So what I did is I took some of them and I isolated them so you can see them better. Okay, here's what's at the top of the letter. It says, remember Little Rock, and you see a soldier with a rifle and a bayonet marching kids with books in their hands. So you have forced integration by federal troops in Little Rock. Okay, the other thing it says at the top is join the Citizens Council, states' rights, racial integrity, and constitutional government. And the third, it says at the top of the letter, is the Mississippi Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. So it's a you know, like a patriotic, historical association. Okay, what's his message? I underlined in red the most terrible parts of it. He's writing to President Eisenhower, and he says, we wish you'd get hold of yourself and again order segregation. This seems unlikely, Therefore, it appears to us that you would rather see white and Negro bodies piled high in the streets so their blood will mingle freely in the gutters. This is the only way our blood will mix. This is the last you'll hear from me as far as begging and pleading for you to restore states' rights, racial integrity, and constitutional government to the land. So this is a letter from a Klan leader to the president. What underlying attitudes about racial equality can you discern from what you've seen of this document? Integration means war, race war. Absolutely. And it's a very open thread. It's not even veiled. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, you're going to see bodies piled in the streets. This Baron de la Beckwith will be famous in a few years. I don't know if you know his name, but if anybody does, do you know who he was? Anybody say anything in the chat box about him? It's the denial of humanity to African Americans. He will be famous up until about the 1990s. Beckwith will be. So yeah, he killed Medgar Evers. In 1963, Medgar Evers, a civil rights leader in Mississippi, was in the driveway of his home in front of his family, and Beckwith gunned him down. And he was not convicted by local juries. And finally, much later, when he was an old man, he was put back on trial in the 1990s and ultimately convicted of murder and spent the rest of his life in jail. But it wasn't just the Klan. It wasn't just the segregated buses. There was more. And one of the big things that reinforced racial separation in the 1950s Jim Crow era is congressional obstacles to civil rights, the seniority system in Congress, because power at that time was based in seniority. It still is, but not to the same extent. But at that time, it was almost totally based on seniority. And the one-party South had the most senior members of Congress because they keep sending the same people back to Washington again. So in the 50s, these Southerners were the chairs of major committees. And so civil rights legislation could never get out of committee. And the second thing, if it did, then there was the Senate filibuster, and Southerners would use the filibuster to delay and kill legislation. So here's a cartoon that was in the Washington newspapers when the Civil Rights Bill of 1957, which was the first civil rights legislation after Reconstruction. So that didn't go to the Judiciary Committee by a fancy maneuver that Vice President Richard Nixon pulled in the Senate. It was able to avoid the Judiciary Committee. And you see the scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's a character called Little Liza running across the ice to escape from the slave patrol. And the cartoonist imagines that his readers will recognize that. And you see the Judiciary Committee on its trail, and you see the filibuster with a shotgun waiting for it. And that's the situation that civil rights legislation would face in Congress in the 1950s. So today, when they're talking about the filibuster, and you hear how people will say, yeah, the filibuster was the prime weapon of anti-civil rights forces, there's an illustration of it right there in that cartoon. And so, you can ask the question about racial attitudes in Congress, but I want to move on to a couple other documents because our time is so short. I found this one kind of interesting, and I really wanted to share it with you because it's from that same, it's from the hearings on that same piece of legislation, the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And it is from Attorney General William P. Rogers, who will later be a major figure in Watergate because he'll be Nixon's Attorney General. And so this is from a from a report he did. What happened there? We've lost our, here we are. Okay, we're gonna go back to present mode again and see. There we are, and see if we can get back on track. I don't know what the computer did, but we were able to triumph, I'm glad to say. So we've got this piece of, oh, it's the chat box, that's the problem. I get it. All right, okay. All right, we're good. So he's reporting about the situation in Ouachita Parish, Louisiana. And he says that certain members and officers of the Citizens Council of Ouachita Parish have commenced an examination of the register of the voters of Ouachita Parish. Does this have a contemporary ring at all to you? And so what they do is these self-appointed people are going to make out affidavits, and they're going to challenge the registration, say that certain voter registrations are fraudulent. And so such affidavits, if you notice where it's underlined in red, were filed challenging every one of the 2,389 Negro voters in Ward 10. None of the 4,054 white voters in that ward were challenged. The registrar, says down the bottom there, if you look where it's underlined, the registrar accepted their affidavits, even though she knew that each affidavit had not examined the registration cards of each registered voter. So you can see what they're doing is they're using this challenge to voter registrations basically to deny people the right to vote. And again, because time is short, I want to show you a couple other things. Here's a letter from Jackie Robinson in 1958. And this and the telegrams that follow it are going to get at another topic, which I'm going to try to squeeze in. So we were talking about problems in Congress and problems with voting, which would be sort of like political roadblocks, political ways that the Jim Crow era affected the lives of African Americans. Now, what about prevalent attitudes among white people? Attitudes that are so like, you know, deep and long-standing that you don't even notice them. Well, here's Jackie Robinson, the great baseball player. After his career, he was vice president of Chock Full of Nuts Coffee Company, and he's writing to President Eisenhower in 1958. And here I blew up his letter so you could see it a little better. He says, I was sitting in the audience at the summit meeting of Negro leaders yesterday when you said we must have patience. On hearing you say this, I felt like standing up and saying, oh no, not again. And then you go down to where it's, I put a red bar next to it, and he says, 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we are entitled to as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressively goals which all other Americans achieved over 150 years ago. Don't tell us to sit and wait and be patient. Or if you're using the Langston Hughes poem about go slow, you know, from the, or whatever happens to a dream deferred from the 1920s, it's similar. But another attitude is the attitude that you see in this telegram. And the kids will be astounded to see there was such a thing as email before there was email, the Western Union telegram. And this is from the leaders of the NAACP in Michigan. And they're writing to President Truman in 1960. So after President Truman has left office and he's just a former president. And President Truman has heard that the lunch counter sit-ins have taken place, and he has responded to them. And President Truman's response to the lunch counter sit-ins is, if anyone came into my store and tried to stop business, I'd throw him out. Now look what he says. The Negro should behave himself and show he's a good citizen. And so the leaders of the NAACP write, and they say, surely, Mr. President, you can't be serious. He says, oh no, I'm serious. I meant it. I meant what I said. And so, you know, the attitude here is that Blacks should be patient and Blacks should behave themselves. And so, you know, you can see how these attitudes are going to affect lives in the Jim Crow era. And I want to sort of wrap up by looking at the situation in the 1960s. And this is from a lesson we have called Congress Protects the Right to Vote, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the last thing I'll get you to comment on is this document here. These are voting rights statistics you can get from that lesson. They were submitted to Congress by Attorney General Katzenbach, and they show the numbers of voters, voter participation in 11 Alabama counties. His documents cover all cover a lot of states, including they have documents, statistics from Maine as well. But I just chose this Alabama snippet because it makes the point. Okay, what do you see here that suggests the impact of racial discrimination in Jim Crow America? Well, look at the percentages in these columns. Here are the white registration, the 1, 2, 3. The fourth column over is white registration for voters. So you can see in Bullitt County, you have 2,631 white registrants. That's 110% of the white people are registered to vote. It's a very patriotic county. Next column is the black registers. There are 4,000 residents, so it's a majority black county, but there are only 1,386 of them registered, only 31% of the African Americans. Go all the way to the bottom for the most dramatic example, Wilcox County, where there are 2,647 whites. They're all registered to vote. 100% of the whites are registered. And in the black population of 6,085, nobody's registered. There are no black voters. So, is this evidence of Jim Crow laws and practices? What does this document show? Voter intimidation, voter suppression, absolutely. Yeah, in Wilcox County, if you read the Garrow book about the Voting Rights Act, David Garrow's book, you'll see he says the Wilcox County situation was caused because the Klan was so active there. Nobody would dare vote. And 110,000 shows some kind of fraud. Well, people were so patriotic, they voted even after they were deceased, apparently. But yeah, there's a lot of fraud. And what you can notice if you have the kids crunch the numbers, these are counties where you have a majority of African-American residents in some cases, but they're controlled by the whites because the blacks don't or can't vote. And so, you know, it is white supremacy in political terms. I want to wrap up. Unfortunately, we only have this short amount of time. I would love to have gone on much longer with you, but I think we'll wrap up with this speech from Lyndon Johnson, 3 excerpts from it. He gave this in March of 1965. It's called The American Promise. And it was the speech he delivered on TV when this Voting Rights Act was submitted to the House Judiciary Committee. He says, there's no Negro problem. There's no Southern problem or Northern problem. There's only an American problem. And we are met as Americans to solve it. This was the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose. The great phrases of that purpose still sound in every American heart, North and South. All men are created equal. Government by consent of the governed. Give me liberty or give me death. Those words are a promise to every citizen that he shall share in the dignity of man. This dignity cannot be found in a man's possessions or his power or his position. It rests on his right to be treated as a man equal in opportunity to all others. It says that he shall share in freedom, choose his leaders, educate his children, provide for his family according to his abilities and merits as a human. And then Johnson, this guy from the South, looks up at the Southern bigwigs in Congress, the most powerful members of the Congress, and he says, their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. And I apologize if that's all the time we have. I wish we had more time to talk about this question of how Jim Crow laws and practices limited the freedom of Black Americans. But I hope I've given you some resources that you can take into your classroom using these 5 lessons, that you can engage your kids in this conversation. Because the important thing is that the voters of tomorrow have thought about the importance of racial equality in American history and in American life and in America's future. So how can you access the resources? You go to archives.gov/legislative and you go to resources. And so when you go to archives.gov/legislative and you go to resources, you'll see this tab. And then these are the lessons that you see up on the upper right there in the corner of the screen right now. And you'll see that there's fundamental principles of government, Congress and history, and how Congress works. We have 42 lessons on there. And so you can go in there and get them, and they're all free, and they all have all the sort of PDF worksheets and so on that you need to explore these resources. So I hope that you'll do that. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back over to Jim.
Wow. Thank you, Charlie. That was for our inaugural. So you all, just to remind you all, that was our inaugural presentation for racial discrimination in the Jim Crow era. That was amazing. That was the first time I've seen it. Very powerful stuff, Charlie. Thank you so much. Remember, folks, I'm just going to wrap up briefly with a few things about the foundation and some things we offer, and we're going to go back to Joe, who's going to do a Q&A. So we're not quite done yet. We are extending for those of you who have the time, and I have a feeling many of you will want to do that. But for those of you who appreciated this, Joe alluded to this at the very beginning. The foundation with Charlie and the Center for Legislative Archives is offering a variety of different workshops, one on suffrage in their own words, on the legislative process, on the Constitution and teaching it. I think everyone likely has to teach the Constitution at some point. It's a difficult document to teach. Charlie does an amazing job with that, and there's quite a few others. So at our website, nationalarchivesfoundation.org/civics, or at nara.gov, you can find the full list. I also wanted to mention, either get a hold of Joe, because you probably have his email address, or you can get a hold of me. We'll make sure that each and every one of you has the availability of getting all the background documents and everything that Charlie had presented. So we thank you for that. We also wanted to ask you to take our survey. It was just in there, I believe. So use our Survey Monkey. We would really like to know what you thought and other programs that you think could help and assist you. As the foundation, we do have a shop, and for each and every one of you, we're actually giving you a discount today, 15% off. If you go to nationalarchivesstore.org, use Civics 15. It's good until the end of the day tomorrow at midnight. Please go in there. There's lots of great stuff to shop at, and that's right. There's books. There's all kinds of stuff you can do and to purchase and buy. Online resources, very briefly. Charlie mentioned Docs Teach, which we've supported for years. It's a tremendous resource, and there's actual professional development training on how to use Docs Teach, which can be offered as well. We're very proud. We're offering. We're collaborating with the education team on providing some Native American tribal primary source workshops. We just finished supporting DigiTreaties. It's an online portal that has over 347 digitized Native American treaties with the U.S. government, and a variety of interaction and maps that are quite amazing and interesting to utilize in a classroom setting. Quite frankly, for anybody, I've been on there quite often lately. Another online portal program, a program that we put together, is on Seas of Knowledge, taking old Navy logbooks from the 19th and 20th century and getting them into a digitized format, allowing for calculations and simulations of the Earth's climate, as well as severity of storms. We're working with, this is a project with NOAA, as along with the University of Washington. We're very proud of that. Lots of stuff online now, and ability to engage folks. You don't have to be in DC anymore to engage the archives, and that's a thrill for the foundation because we can leverage that in a variety of different ways. Last thing from us, we have virtual programming tied to the National Archives holdings. We have a Presidential Library series. The next one is April 14th at 5 p.m. Eastern. That's the Presidential Library. George H.W. Bush, the director, will be on talking a little bit about that library. That's been a very popular one. And then on April 29th at 5 p.m., we continue with our First Ladies programming, and it's on celebrating and discussing the First Ladies, how they were controversial, how they used their platform in a very unique way. Eleanor Roosevelt, Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, etc. So that's been well received. With that, I wanted to thank you personally. I will be on, but off camera. I'm going to go back to Joe, who's going to lead a Q&A session, and Charlie is still around as well. Thank you all very much. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Jim and Charlie. Yes, if you're in here, there is a chat. The National Archives Foundation has a survey for you, so if you can grab that in the chat at some point. So I understood, Charlie, you're going to send, or I can get a copy of the presentation. I can pair that with the webinar then on our professional learning page.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll make sure that you have that.
Yeah, we have it right now. I will send it to you, Joe.
Perfect. Yep. Because then as soon as people always want to know where they can find the recording or where it is. It takes me an hour or so to get it processed, but I will get that uploaded with the presentation. I'm also buying myself a little bit of time here to see if anybody has any questions for you, Charlie. Now would be the time to ask them.
And they can just turn their sound on and ask them, or we'll use any means.
If they would like to, we can give them permission. We can allow to talk if they would like to. If you would like to come on directly with your video or your audio to talk to Charlie directly, let us know. I can give you the ability to talk. Otherwise, drop it into the chat box. And again, we will have an informal discussion after we hit the end of the recording as well, if that is more your style. I love the documents for DC. As a teacher in DC, I would like to use the documents. Can they find them on the archives website?
Yes, every document in this PowerPoint had its NAID, which is National Archives ID number. You go to archives.gov, you go to the tab that says Research Our Records, and you simply type that number into the search box, and you will instantly be at that document. So if you want to start the class with the document and have it on the projector or something, you just type that number into the National Archives website and up it will come. But as I mentioned at the start and the end of my presentation, the documents I showed you today, with a couple of exceptions, are all in lessons that are on the Center for Legislative Archives website. So you can get them as part of that whole lesson, or as I just described the first way, you can get them as single documents. So you have access to everything. The National Archives exists to get you access to the documents that show our history. So this is just the digital version of that.
We did get that link dropped into the chat as well. Other questions for Charlie about the archives, about the lessons, about the presentation he just gave? I'm waiting for somebody to ask about Nicolas Cage and the Constitution. Is that when is that question going to come up? That's got to be a common question.
I did not see him in the building.
I will say one of my professional highlights occurred in the archives, being able to join the United States Senate Youth Program Washington Week one year when it was hosted by Senator Angus King from Maine. And each of the co-chair senators, Senator Tim Scott for the Republican and Senator Angus King for Democrats, they each have a night. And Senator King's night, we had supper in the rotunda of the things, right? So we're down, not in the circle, but just on the other side of that gate. The gate was open, but in that level area right there, we're having the table. I'm like, am I really having, like, I'm eating what I don't remember what was for dinner. I'm just like, I'm feet away from these documents, just hanging out at night. So
it's a special place.
It is a very special place. We will do last call for any formal questions before we end the recording. Last call. Anybody, I can unmute you if you would like to talk to Charlie directly. Otherwise, put it in the chat. Oh, we do have a Q&A. Jim Crow can be seen as a controversial topic in our politically charged environment. Any suggestions on how to introduce to students?
It is incredibly charged out there. And as teachers, you're really in a difficult position. I think that the more you do up front to establish ground rules for conversations, and I think that getting kids to keep it not personalized by, you know, the fact that these events and situations happened in the past allows you to distance yourself from them. And so we can talk about them at arm's length historically and follow some ground rules for civility. And those are two kind of conventions that we put in place, because what we're trying to do is we're trying not to shout at each other, and we're trying not to bring our personal opinions into the conversation. So I would say go slowly. And every teacher knows the students that they teach, and they're all different. And, you know, sometimes you have that one or two kids who just can't handle a conversation for whatever reason. And so you know how much you can do. But my advice to you is to be cautious and establish clear ground rules for civility and safety before you get into this.
Last call. Thank you for that question. All right, we will keep this live, but for now, I will give our formal thank you to Charlie, to Jim, and the National Archives Foundation staff, everybody who's joined us here this evening. Thank you on behalf of all of our participants and anybody watching this in the future as well. Thank you for sharing your passion and expertise, Charlie.
My pleasure.